Yo, what's up, everybody? I think there's a lot to be said about when you're taking anatomy and physiology and you get to the chapter on the skeletal system, because there's a lot that people know about bones, right? But maybe not the organ system itself. Usually, when people think about bones, they think of it as like these inanimate objects, like these shades, right? These shades are not alive, there is an inanimate object. And they think about the bones the same way, but they don't think about the bones as living tissue. So if you are taking anatomy and physiology now and probably you've come out of the chapters on cells and tissues and things like that, you still have some type of concept in your mind about these things being alive. Um, and that's a good way to go into the skeletal system thinking the same way. Now, keep in mind that the skeletal system, the organs of the skeletal systems are primarily the bones. Yes, there are other tissues and structures that you discuss in the skeletal system, like ligaments and cartilage, and then you get into the joints. We're going to get into that later in some later videos. But for right now, I just want to talk about a few lecture things, more physiology things that you deal with when you're talking about the skeletal system. First thing I want to talk about is the type of bone tissue that there happens to be. And usually in those courses, you talk about compact bone tissue versus spongy bone tissue. Compact bone tissue is when you have layered bone. A lot of that compact bone tissue is in what's called osteons, which are the functional units of compact bone. And what they look like is they look like paper towel rolls. Instead of the tissue or the paper towel wrapped around the core, you've got bone tissue that's wrapped around it. They call it lamellae. Lamellae are layers of bone tissue. So lamellae looks like I took a piece of paper, right, and just wrapped it around around the roll over and over and over again until I've got this paper towel roll of bone tissue. And that's why they call it compact bone, because it's compacted layers of bone laid on top of one another. And so you've got these concentric rings of lamellae that make an osteon. And an osteon would be like a paper towel roll by itself. And then you have osteons, which are paper towel rolls, plural, stacked together, just like if you go to Costco or Sam's or BJ's or some big box store, where you've got all these, where you can buy the giant packs of paper towel rolls or toilet tissue rolls. They have them in the big packs and they have them stacked together. That's how osteons look in compact bone. Compact bone is very dense. It's weighted, so it's heavy. It's very strong. It's very resilient. However, because of its weight, you don't want to have it in the wrong places. So having lots of compact bone in the bones of your arms and in your legs, i.e. long bones, like the phalanges of your fingers, or the ulna and radius and humerus of your arm, or the tibia, fibula, and the femur of your leg. Those are perfect long bones. Those are perfect bones made out of mostly compact bone. But that's because they need to be strong, because they are dealing with the stress and the weight of your body. Versus spongy bone. Spongy bone is exactly what it sounds like. It has a spongy appearance when you look at it under a microscope. It's very porous. It's filled with air spaces or air pockets throughout the bone itself. Spongy bone is strong, but it's lightweight. So you want to see a lot of spongy bone in places like your skull and your sternum and your rib cage. These are structures. The very ends of your long bones have a lot more spongy bone in them than they do compact bone. And that's because you don't want your joints to be so heavy that you can't move and that you wear out your joints. And you want things like your skull to be, the bones of your skull are like sandwiches. They've got two layers of compact bone, and in between the two layers of compact bone, it's all spongy bone to make the skull more lightweight. If your skull was completely compact bone, then it would be like walking around with a 16-pound bowling ball on the end of your neck. And I don't think things would last very well for you doing it that way, living that way. So that's why we have spongy bone and compact bone. Another thing that you run into when you get into these chapters for anatomy and physiology is ligaments versus tendons. And it's easy to mix these two up initially if you don't know about them. I have to admit, when I was taking classes like these, I used to hear ligaments and tendons used interchangeably. So it was difficult for me to figure out which one was which. Ligaments attach bone to bone, while tendons attach muscle to bone. All right, I'll say that again. Ligaments attach bone to bone, tendons attach muscle to bone. Ligaments attach bone to bone because ligaments are actually trying to restrict movement. Some people think that ligaments are trying to help you move. Most of the ligaments of your body are really trying to restrict movement. They are trying to make sure that a joint only moves within its range of motion. Usually when you move a joint beyond its normal range of motion, that's where you end up tearing a ligament. I tore a ligament in my ankle way back when I was playing basketball, and I was in a game and I went up and I blocked this guy's dunk. Yay. But the guy and I got wrapped up on the way down, and the guy got wrapped up. Me and the guy got wrapped up and tied up on the way down, and he landed on my ankle, and it actually twisted my foot around to where my toes were pointing backwards, and it ripped the ligament in some of the ligaments in my ankle, and it was as painful as it sounds, because your foot's not supposed to point backwards. It's got a certain range of motion, and when it goes beyond that range of motion, you end up tearing the ligaments. So ligaments, they resist a lot of movement because they're trying to maintain a certain range of motion for a joint, versus the tendon attaches a muscle to a bone. So when a muscle contracts, it pulls, and then it pulls that tendon, and then that tendon is attached to a bone, so it ends up pulling that bone. And if it pulls that bone, then it causes you to move, and then when it moves that bone and it moves whatever that bone is in, then it moves that body part that the bone is in. So basically, according to the law of ludicrous, when that muscle moves, your tendon moves. When your tendon moves, your bones move. And when your bones move, you move, just like that. For those of you who don't get it yet, I'll get to it when I get to the muscle system, and we'll include a little bit of ludicrous in there so you'll better understand. But that's what tendons do for you. Tendons attach muscle to bone. For those of you who think that you've never seen a tendon before, if you've eaten a piece of chicken, you've probably encountered a piece of tendon. That tendon, we call it gristle, that rubbery thing that's on the end of your meat, especially with a drumstick. That piece of rubbery part that some people think is absolutely disgusting, and they can't stand to get it in their mouth when they're eating fried chicken, baked chicken, fricasseed chicken, boiled chicken, broiled chicken, barbecue chicken, whatever the chicken is. That rubbery stuff, that gristle piece that's attaching the meat to the bone, that's a tendon. All right. So with that being said, another thing that people really run into and start having a lot of questions about is blood cell production, because there's a process called hemopoiesis that happens in the red bone marrow of your bones, and that process is what produces blood cells. Now, at this point in the class, normally your instructor is probably going to really gloss over this, because there's a whole nother chapter later on in the class, or in the second part of the class, depending on where you're taking this class. Usually there's a whole nother chapter on blood cells, and you really get down into the brass tacks of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and how they're formed, and how they all begin their happy little beginnings in red bone marrow. And if you've ever watched the anime series Cells at Work, which is a great anime series, and actually remarkably accurate with a lot of the things that are happening. Yeah, they fudge a few little things with some white blood cell battles and red blood cell activities, but that's because it's an anime. But for the most part, a lot of what they deal with in the anime is quite effective and quite true. And they talk about in Cells at Work, they get into where all these cells come from. and the fact that they all start off in red bone marrow, which is in your bones. So that's another thing about your bone tissue. It's living tissue, and it's got living tissue inside the living tissue that's doing something totally different than just giving you structure and strength. You're practically creating the blood cells that keep you alive every single day. Another thing that your bone tissue does that you want to keep in mind is that it's a savings account. It's literally a bank. It's banking minerals, and it's actually banking minerals and vitamins, which some people don't really talk about that very often. But for the sake of argument, we'll talk about the minerals. That is banking minerals. You store them there. It's like a big savings account. Calcium and phosphorus, primarily calcium. If you go through anatomy and physiology, you will find out that you use calcium for a lot of stuff. You use calcium like currency. You cannot get away from calcium the entire time you're taking an anatomy and physiology course. Like the whole time you're hearing about something that calcium does. Calcium's doing this, calcium's doing that. You use calcium in your brain, you use calcium in your muscle cells, you use calcium to convert and create hormones. I mean, calcium is used for everything. So needless to say, because you use calcium for so many different things, it makes sense that you would need to have your calcium banked somewhere, right? So we store calcium in our bone tissue. So that's important to know, because when we lock that calcium in our bone tissue, we don't just sit it there on a shelf. We actually have to put it in and lock it into the bone tissue a very strategic way, which is usually when you're introduced to the 4 bone cells. You have osteoblasts, osteoclasts, osteocytes, and osteoprogenitor cells. Now, each one of these cells have a different role. And if you're like, wait a minute, wasn't he just talking about minerals being stored in the bone tissue and now he's moved on to cells? Well, that's because these cells, some of them work in the bank, and some of them are responsible for depositing the calcium, and some of them are responsible for withdrawing the calcium. So you can't talk about the storage of minerals in the bone tissue in an effective manner without effectively discussing the bone cells that are actively involved. So first thing up that you have is osteoprogenitor cells. Osteo means bone, progenitor means father. So you've got these bone father cells, and these bone father cells are actually stem cells. They're bone stem cells whose sole purpose in life is really just to produce more bone cells. That's what osteoprogenitor cells do. So osteoprogenitor cells, osteo means bone, progenitor means father. These are the father cells, the stem cells that produce other bone cells. This is actually how you get osteoblasts. Osteo means bone, blast means immature, but there's also another meaning to blast that's less common nowadays, and that's that blast also means to build. Usually when you have a cell, a blast cell, usually that cell is an immature cell, and oftentimes that cell is responsible for building something, just like fibroblast cells are responsible for building protein fibers. Osteoblast cells are immature cells that are bone cells that are responsible for producing bone. They build bone. Well, when they build bone, in order to make bone rigid, to make it more durable, it puts calcium in it. And when it puts the calcium in it, you don't lose the calcium. It just deposits the calcium in the bone matrix. And that's what makes the bone tissue so dense and so rigid. Osteoblast pouring in some calcium, stirring it up, and therefore making the bone tissue far more dense and rigid than it would be without it. So it makes a deposit of calcium into the bone tissue. That makes it rigid and dense. Well, that tells me which cell deposits calcium. So who is responsible for making a withdrawal? Well, osteoclasts with a C are the ones who are responsible for making a withdrawal of this bone tissue. So just like osteoblasts build bone tissue and deposit calcium into the bone tissue to make it dense and rigid. You have osteoclasts who emit a special enzyme and acid that actually dissolves and breaks down bone tissue, and then it releases the calcium that was originally put in there. And that calcium is now taken and put into the bloodstream for you to use. So osteoclasts are responsible for the withdrawal of this calcium ions. So osteoblasts build the bone tissue, they deposit calcium ions into the bone tissue, and then osteoclasts dissolve the bone tissue, they break it down. Class means to break. That class, so in science, class with a C means to break. So osteoclasts, they break the bone tissue down, and then that releases the calcium, so it allows you to make a withdrawal of the calcium ions. Now osteocytes are what osteoblasts are after osteoblasts have done their job. Like I said earlier, that osteoblasts, they secrete bone matrix and they add calcium to it and make it harder and more dense and more rigid. And that is true. But the other thing is that once they do this, they do it all around themselves. They surround themselves into little rooms. We call these little rooms lacunae, which actually translates into little room, right? And so they surround themselves with lacunae and into little lacunae by surrounding themselves with bone tissue. And since they're immobile and they're trapped in these little rooms, they decide to manage, they take care of the bone tissue that they've made. They maintain that little apartment of bone tissue, and they upgrade into a mature bone cell called an osteocyte, which osteocyte means mature bone cell. So now they've gone from osteoblasts into osteocytes. And if you break a bone, or you have a small fracture and you break open those lacunae and their apartment gets torn open, then they actually revert back to osteoblasts, rebuild their apartment, move back in, surround themselves with bone tissue, upgrade back into an osteocyte, and go back to taking care of their apartment again. Osteoclasts don't do that at all. Osteoclasts just worry about breaking down bone tissue when you need it. And osteoclasts are interesting because osteoclasts, even though we call them bone cells, they're not 100% bone cells. If you look up osteoclasts, you'll find out that osteoclasts have more in common with white blood cells than they do the other bone cells. True fact. All right, so that's where we'll stop for now. Next time we're going to make a video and we're going to talk about who tells the bone cells what to do. Like, how do bone cells know what to do next? Stay tuned. We'll be talking about that in the next video. If you like this video, make sure you hit like. And if you haven't done it already, subscribe. And feel free to share this video with your friends. If you got any questions, leave them below in the comments. We'll see you on the next video.